3 months after I buried my husband, I walked out my front door with a cup of coffee in one hand and found a legal notice taped right across the storm door. Not tucked into the mailbox, not slipped under the mat, but taped there where every neighbor walking by could see it. At first, I honestly thought somebody had made a mistake. We'd lived in that little neighborhood outside Huntsville for almost 14 years. My husband, Daniel, believed in paying every bill early, filing every receipt, and keeping copies of things most people would have thrown away without a second thought. If there was one thing he couldn't stand, it was loose ends. So when I peeled that paper off the glass and saw the words, "Notice of Property Lien," my hands started shaking before I'd even finished reading the first paragraph. According to the Homeowners Association, I owed a special assessment I supposedly ignored, and because I had failed to pay, they were preparing to secure the debt against my house. The amount listed wasn't even that large at first, just enough to make me think maybe I'd missed something while trying to survive the hardest months of my life. Losing Daniel had turned every day into a fog. Some mornings I couldn't even remember whether I'd eaten breakfast, let alone whether some HOA letter had arrived weeks earlier. I told myself there had to be an explanation. There always is, right? I called the association office that afternoon, and the woman who answered sounded almost cheerful. She told me to come in Thursday morning, bring my checkbook, and we'd get everything taken care of. I actually thanked her. Looking back now, that's the part that still makes me laugh. I walked into that office believing I was solving a misunderstanding. They already believed they were taking my house. Thursday morning, I wore one of Daniel's old denim jackets because it still smelled faintly like the cedar closet he'd built himself years ago. Little things like that become anchors after someone dies. The property manager, a woman named Vanessa, barely looked up when I sat down across from her desk. She slid a folder toward me like she was handing over a restaurant menu. "Here's your updated balance," she said. Updated. Such a harmless little word. I looked down and felt my stomach drop. The number had exploded. Late penalties, attorney fees, administrative costs, interest, collection expenses. What had started as a small assessment had somehow turned into more than $6,000. I stared at the paper for several seconds before I finally asked, "How did this happen? I never received any notice." Vanessa leaned back in her chair, folded her arms, and shrugged with the kind of expression people wear when they think your problems are inconveniencing their afternoon. "Whether you open the letters isn't really our concern." I told her there weren't any letters. "I check my mailbox every single day." She sighed dramatically, rolled her eyes, then said something I'll never forget as long as I live. "Mrs. Carter, your husband handled these things. He's gone now. Maybe this house is more than you can manage by yourself." For a second, I couldn't even respond. It wasn't just what she said. It was how casually she said it, like she was commenting on the weather. Then she pushed another document across the desk. "If finances are becoming difficult, there are investors who work with us. You could sign the property over before things become embarrassing." Embarrassing. That word echoed all the way home. I didn't yell. I didn't cry in front of her. I simply stood up, picked up my purse, looked her straight in the eyes, and said, "I'm not signing anything today." She smiled. Not a friendly smile either, the kind people wear when they're already convinced they've won. I drove home in complete silence. Halfway there, I actually pulled over because my hands wouldn't stop trembling on the steering wheel. Part of me wondered if she was right. Maybe I couldn't keep up anymore. Maybe Daniel had been carrying more than I ever realized. Maybe I was already losing everything we'd spent 26 years building together. But when I unlocked the garage that evening, I noticed something sitting exactly where it had always been. A wall of dusty storage boxes stacked with Daniel's careful handwriting across the sides. Taxes, insurance, utilities, HOA. He labeled everything. I almost walked past them. Then I heard his voice in my head the way memories sometimes sneak up on you. Never throw paperwork away until you're absolutely sure nobody can use it against you. I smiled despite myself. It sounded exactly like something he'd say after watching one too many courtroom shows. So instead of making dinner, I dragged the first box into the living room. Then another. By midnight, my coffee table disappeared beneath old binders, envelopes, meeting minutes, newsletters, canceled checks, neighborhood maps, and years of correspondence that most people would have considered worthless clutter. I kept telling myself I probably wasn't going to find anything useful. I just needed to understand what had happened. Somewhere around 1 in the morning, I found one of Daniel's yellow sticky notes attached to a folder. In his crooked handwriting he'd written, "Board-like shortcuts. Watch the meeting minutes." I frowned. Shortcuts? What did that mean? I opened the folder and realized Daniel hadn't simply kept records. He'd been documenting patterns. Certain homeowners always seemed to get warning letters before fines. Others didn't. Certain violations quietly disappeared after board members changed their minds. Others turned into expensive legal disputes almost overnight. At first it looked like coincidence. Then the pattern became impossible to ignore. My husband hadn't been paranoid. He'd been paying attention. And as I reached deeper into the final box sitting beside the fireplace, my fingers brushed against a small flash drive sealed inside an envelope with one sentence written across the front in black marker. If they ever get greedy, play this first. I don't know what I expected to hear when I plugged that flash drive into my old laptop, but it certainly wasn't laughter. There were a handful of audio files, each labeled with nothing more than a date, and the newest one opened with the familiar sound of folding chairs scraping across a clubhouse floor. Somebody joked about coffee. Somebody complained about the landscaping budget. Then the meeting drifted into routine business until one voice cut through the room. "We're wasting too much time following every little procedure," a man said, sounding almost bored. "Half these people never read the bylaws anyway." Another board member chuckled before replying, "Especially the smaller cases. Nobody ever checks." The room laughed again, and I just sat there staring at the screen. They weren't talking about a broken sprinkler or holiday decorations. They were talking about homeowners. People like me. I replayed that section 4 times because my brain refused to believe what my ears had heard. Daniel hadn't left me random paperwork. He'd left me a trail. By sunrise, I hadn't slept at all, but for the first time since his funeral, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt angry. Monday morning, I called an attorney named Michael Brennan, a quiet man a friend from church recommended after hearing what had happened. His receptionist squeezed me in that afternoon, and I walked into his office carrying 2 banker boxes that looked like they weighed as much as I did. Michael smiled politely at first, probably assuming another widow needed help negotiating with an HOA. Then I played 60 seconds of that recording. His smile disappeared. He leaned forward, asked me to rewind it, and listened again without saying a word. When it finished, he rested both elbows on his desk and finally said, "Mrs. Carter, I think your husband knew something was wrong long before anyone else did." For the next 2 weeks, our lives revolved around those boxes. Every receipt became a clue. Every email became part of a timeline. Michael hired a paralegal who built spreadsheets comparing payment histories across the entire subdivision. We requested financial records, meeting notices, mailing logs, and assessment reports. At first, everything looked messy but ordinary, the kind of paperwork any volunteer board might produce. Then the pattern emerged so clearly that even Michael stopped talking for a full minute. Nearly 3/4 of the neighborhood had never paid that same special assessment in full. Some had ignored it completely. Others had paid months late. Yet only a tiny group of homeowners had liens threatened against them. 23 addresses, mine included. We pinned every address on a large county map covering Michael's conference room wall. That's when another pattern appeared. Nearly every targeted homeowner had argued with the board at some point during the previous 4 years. One had challenged a landscaping contract. Another complained about missing reserve funds. One elderly veteran had refused to remove an American flag the board claimed violated community standards. A young couple questioned rising dues during an annual meeting. And then there was me, or rather, Daniel. 2 years earlier, he'd stood up during a budget meeting and calmly asked why legal expenses had doubled without member approval. Nobody answered his question. They simply moved to the next agenda item. Michael tapped the map with a pencil. "This isn't random," he said quietly. "It's selective enforcement." I'd never heard that phrase before, but once he explained it, everything clicked into place. Rules weren't being applied equally. They were being weaponized. We filed public record requests. We subpoenaed financial documents. We requested email archives between board members. The lawsuit itself wasn't filed immediately because Michael wanted the evidence ready before anyone had a chance to destroy it. Meanwhile, the HOA kept sending collection notices every week, each one sounding more threatening than the last. One letter warned that foreclosure could become the next step if I failed to resolve the debt immediately. I remember holding that envelope in my kitchen while looking out the window at the oak tree Daniel planted the year we moved in. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was offended. They honestly believed intimidation would make me disappear. The complaint was finally filed on a rainy Tuesday morning. Michael attached the audio recording, payment comparisons, meeting minutes, and dozens of supporting exhibits. Within 48 hours, the HOA hired outside litigation counsel. A week later, they contacted Michael asking whether I'd consider resolving the matter privately. He looked over at me after hanging up the phone and smiled. "Funny," he said. "They sounded much more confident before we filed." We declined. If they wanted this over quickly, they should have thought about that before threatening widows with foreclosure. Discovery began shortly afterward, and that's when the entire story changed. Internal emails started arriving in batches. Hundreds of pages. At first, most were harmless discussions about landscaping, pool maintenance, and parking complaints. Then one message appeared with the subject line, "Priority Collections." Attached was a spreadsheet listing homeowners. Besides, several names were handwritten notes after someone printed it. "Always complains. Problem family. Push harder. No extensions." Next to my address, someone had scribbled, "Husband gone. Less resistance." I had to leave Michael's office after reading that sentence. I sat on a bench outside for almost 20 minutes because I honestly thought I was going to be sick. Losing Daniel had already been the worst thing I'd ever experienced. Seeing strangers discuss his death as if it were a business opportunity unlocked a kind of heartbreak I didn't know existed. When I came back inside, Michael didn't say much. He simply slid a tissue box toward me and quietly continued organizing evidence. There wasn't anything else to say. They'd told us exactly who they were. More witnesses came forward after word of the lawsuit spread. An older gentleman admitted the board threatened him after he questioned reserve spending. A retired schoolteacher produced emails showing repeated fines that mysteriously vanished once she agreed to stop attending meetings. Even a former landscaping contractor described conversations suggesting certain homeowners should be taught a lesson. Every interview added another brick to the wall they had built around themselves. The irony wasn't lost on me. They thought nobody paid attention because most people were busy living their lives. They were right. But Daniel had paid attention. Every odd meeting, every missing notice, every strange vote. He quietly kept copies while everyone else assumed nothing would ever matter. I used to tease him about saving too much paperwork. Now those dusty boxes were speaking louder than anyone in the boardroom ever had. About a month after discovery started, Vanessa herself appeared for a deposition. She walked in wearing the same confident smile I'd seen the day she suggested I sign away my home. It lasted less than an hour. Michael calmly placed one email after another in front of her, asking simple questions. "Is this your message? Did you write this? Were these your instructions?" She answered yes, over and over again. Then he placed the printed spreadsheet with my address highlighted in yellow on the table. "Can you explain the note beside Mrs. Carter's home?" Silence. For the first time since I'd met her, Vanessa couldn't find anything to say. She stared at the page, glanced toward her attorney, and lowered her eyes. Walking out of that deposition, Michael looked at me and said something Daniel would have appreciated. The truth doesn't always arrive quickly, but when it finally shows up, it usually brings friends. I smiled for what felt like the first genuine time in months because deep down I knew the fight wasn't over yet. But for the first time, they were no longer deciding how my story ended. The settlement conference was scheduled for exactly 89 days after that notice first appeared on my front door. By then, the confidence the board had worn like expensive cologne had completely evaporated. Their attorneys weren't talking about collecting assessments anymore. They were talking about limiting damage. Michael and I sat across the table while stacks of evidence filled 3 binders between us. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. Every email, every financial record, every deposition had already done the talking. Their attorney cleared his throat and slid a proposal across the table. They would release the lien immediately. They would dismiss every collection action against me. They would pay my legal expenses. Michael glanced at me but didn't say anything because we both knew that wasn't enough. This had stopped being about me weeks ago. I looked at the attorney and quietly asked, "What about everyone else?" The room fell silent. He frowned. "Excuse me." I reached into my folder and placed the spreadsheet on the table, the same one showing every homeowner they had selectively targeted. "You didn't just threaten my house. You built a system that punished people you didn't like. If this ends today, it ends for all of them. They asked for a recess. 45 minutes later, they came back looking 10 years older. The final agreement was bigger than I ever imagined when I first carried those dusty boxes into Michael's office. They agreed to pay me $40,000 in damages, cover every dollar of my legal fees, remove the lien from my property, and permanently dismiss the collection action. More importantly, they also agreed to withdraw liens and collection proceedings against every homeowner whose case had been handled under the same selective enforcement practices. Within 2 weeks, 6 widows received certified letters confirming their liens had been released. 15 other families watched pending collection actions disappear. One elderly man called me in tears because he'd spent months believing he would lose the home he'd shared with his late wife. "I can finally sleep again," he told me. "I still think about that phone call more than the settlement check." Money fixes bills. Peace fixes people. The fallout inside the association came quickly after that. The board president resigned before the next community meeting, claiming personal reasons, though everyone in the room understood the real reason. 2 additional directors stepped down before an internal review could even begin. Vanessa quietly left her position a short time later. I never saw her again. Sometimes people ask whether I felt satisfaction watching everything fall apart. The honest answer is, not exactly. I didn't enjoy seeing people lose careers or reputations. What I enjoyed was seeing accountability finally catch up with people who believed it never would. There's a difference. A neighborhood only works when the rules belong to everyone, not just the people holding the keys to the clubhouse. A month after everything was finalized, I walked into the hallway where that original lien notice had been taped. I could still picture it sitting there, flapping in the breeze while neighbors slowed down just enough to wonder what I'd done wrong. I took the settlement check, made a framed copy of it, and hung it on the exact same nail. Same wall, same spot. The paper looked different, but the lesson stayed the same. Every time I pass it, I think about Daniel. Not because of the money, because he never stopped believing that details mattered. He never threw away receipts everyone else considered junk. He never assumed somebody else would protect our family if he didn't. In a strange way, he was still standing beside me through every hearing, every document review, every difficult day. His voice was in those boxes. His patience became my courage. And the people who dismissed a grieving widow as an easy target never realized they were really fighting 2 people, the woman standing in front of them, and the man who quietly prepared her years before either of us knew she'd need it. Every neighborhood has disagreements. Every community has imperfect leaders. But there's a line between making mistakes and abusing authority, and once people with power start believing certain neighbors deserve different treatment, the damage spreads far beyond one property or one family. That's why I still tell this story today. Not because I won, but because too many people surrender the moment an official-looking letter shows up on the front door. Sometimes those letters are legitimate. Sometimes they aren't. The only way to know the difference is to ask questions, keep records, and refuse to let intimidation replace the truth. So now I'd like to hear from you. If you discovered your own community leaders had been enforcing rules differently, depending on who they liked, would you fight back, or would you walk away to protect your peace? Do you think what happened to that board was justice, or did the consequences go too far? Share your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this spark conversations every neighborhood should be willing to have. And if you've ever seen ordinary people stand up to unfair power and refuse to back down, I'd love to hear your story too.